I want to talk to you a little bit about history, about New Brunswick, a story of progress. If you go back 40 and 50 years, New Brunswick has made enormous strides over that period. In 1960, the average income in the province was, the spread between New Brunswick and the rest of the country was 40%. Our average income was 40% lower. That spread has declined to 11% since 1960. The number of people below the low-income cutoff has been cut in half. The quality of our infrastructure, whether it's roads or schools or hospitals or telecommunications, is much, much better now than it has been in the past. So we've made great progress in industry, great progress in social policy, great progress in environmental policy. So it really has been a success story. But something happened in 2008. Our economy stopped growing. So you will recall that across Canada, we did face the Great Recession. It was a recession across the country. But after 2008, every other province, to some level or other, came out of that recession. And many of them came out very strongly. We didn't. Our economy remained flat and has remained flat since 2008. No real economic growth since 2008. And at the same time, again, right around the same time as 2008, our workforce started to shrink for the first time in history. So if you go back to previous recessions in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, after the recession was done, the workforce started to grow strongly. Young people joined the workforce by the thousands. And that didn't happen after 2008. The rate now, the more people are exiting the workforce than entering the workforce. And I believe that is really starting to cause a serious economic challenge for the province. And it's becoming a drag on our future economy. If we cannot solve our workforce problem, if we cannot get the workforce growing again, I believe we will continue to see a stagnant economy, and that will have many, many ripple effects. One of the big challenges, why we all need to be concerned about this, is that it will eventually touch us all. If we don't have a strong economic foundation in the province, if we don't have a significant number of people working and creating labor income and paying taxes, we risk funding to things like education and health care. These are very important things that we care about in this province, having good health care, good education, good road infrastructure, good public services, a strong social safety net. All of these things rely on a strong economic foundation. And as we've seen in recent months, it forces governments, a weak economy forces governments to make tough decisions about taxes and about spending cuts. So what we need to do is figure out a way to get back to economic growth, at least moderate economic growth, and that will require addressing this workforce challenge. So if you go back to the 1970s again, a little bit of history, New Brunswick was the second youngest province in the country as measured by median age. Alberta was an older province than us. The average age of a typical person in 1971 was about 23. So the average person in the province was about 23 years old. Now, if you fast forward to 2015, the average age is about 45. So that may or may not sound like much, depending on your perspective, but that, from a demographic perspective, that is a fundamental shift. And yes, the shift is occurring across Canada in some respects, but as you can see from the Alberta trend line, we're decoupling from the rest of Canada. And in fact, we are now the second oldest province. Newfoundland and Labrador shares the distinction of being the oldest province, but we are the second oldest province in Canada. And of course, we are just heading into the wave of boomer retirement. So without some structural shift or change in our demographics, we are just going to continue to get older, and that's going to continue to put pressure on our labor market and on our economy. So, for example, we estimate that about 80,000 people will retire within the next 10 years or so. Now, that's a fluid number. A lot of people are going to retire later, and that's a good thing. But just in general, because of the wave of baby boomers heading toward retirement, we know that a lot will be retiring, tens and tens of thousands, and we know that there's not enough uptake to fill in the gaps that they will leave in the workforce. So one of the things that we're really concerned about is many of our export industries. Now, why this matters is because export industries actually bring money into the province. So the product or service is created in the province, sold outside the province, and money is brought into the province to grow the economy. If those industries suffer, if they reduce their economic activity and their economic contribution to the province, it actually reduces the size of the economy, reduces the tax base, and reduces, again, our ability to pay for public services and public infrastructure. So we're very concerned about these at-risk export industries. They are industries like blueberries, which is a fast-growing industry in the province, but starting to face labor shortages, seafoods, aquaculture, fish processing. Of course, you've probably heard about some of these stories in the news, the inability, the challenges that these companies are facing trying to find labor. Even industries like traditional agriculture and our potato sector are starting to really face labor shortages. But it goes beyond that. Even our manufacturing sector, in the last 10 years, we've lost over 10,000 manufacturing jobs. Some of those jobs have been lost to technological change and productivity improvements, but a lot of them have been lost because the companies have not been able to find workers. And it even extends to our professional sectors. So our business service sector, our call center sector, which is strong here in Moncton, has lost over 10,000 jobs since 2006. Many of the jobs have been lost because the companies have not been able to source workers. Even our trucking sector. Most of the big trucking companies in the province now are struggling to find people that want to work in the trucking industry. That's a little bit counterintuitive when you think about the fact that we have a relatively high unemployment rate and the fact that a lot of our young people continue to leave New Brunswick to find and build their careers elsewhere. So this is a bit of a paradox. It's a bit of a challenge. But it is true that we have a relatively high unemployment rate. It's a little bit higher than 10% in the most recent labor force survey. And unemployment is quite high among young people. This is another challenge. We have a lot of industries facing shortages, and yet we have a lot of young unemployed people. But when you look a little closer, you see that a lot of those young people that are unemployed are actually unemployed while they're in school. And so it's very difficult to think that they would be able to feed a lot of these industries that are facing shortages right now because they're in school. And even after they graduate, they may not have the skills or the interest in working in some of these job industries where we're facing shortages. We also have relatively high unemployment among our older population, or 55 and up. But it's the same challenge. Many of the people that are unemployed are not skilled or have the interest to work in the industries where we have right now many of the shortages. And one of the other things that we're facing too is that many of our young people are leaving the province because they don't want to work in the jobs that are available right now. And that's just a fact. Young people are more mobile now than they've ever been before, and that's a good thing. They go out, they see the world. Many of them will find their way back here, or hopefully will find their way back here. But at the end of the day, we are facing this reality that people will not stay for jobs that don't pay high wages. A lot of people won't stay. So I have a statistic about this, so let me show you this. This chart shows the change in the number of persons under the age of 35 by the reported income level on their tax returns. So basically showing the change between 2008 and 2013 in the number of people reporting less than $35,000 in total income. And that number has actually dropped by 14%. So there's been a 14% decline in the number of young people reporting $35,000 in income and below. At the same time, there's been a 34% increase in the number of young people reporting income of $50,000 and up. Now, why this is significant is because that number is actually larger than the growth rate across Canada. So for jobs that are paying $50,000 and more, they are able to retain young people in the province. But a lot of our export industries, for a variety of reasons, don't pay high wages. So that is our challenge. That's one of our real challenges, is making sure we can have the labor to feed these industries and support these industries and allow that export revenue to come in and bolster our economy. And there are things we can do from a productivity perspective to push wages up, but some of these industries, nationally and internationally, are not high-wage industries. So this is a paradox. We have young people that are unemployed, but they don't necessarily want to work in jobs that pay $40,000 or $30,000 a year. Now, Canada has used immigration as an economic growth driver for decades across all spectrums of the labor market. Low-skilled, semi-skilled, high-skilled. It has been Canada's policy for many, many decades to bring in people to feed the workforce and grow the economy. If you look just since 2008, The Canadian labor market has grown by 1.16 million people just since 2008. The New Brunswick labor market has shrunk by 4,100. So across the country, and the bulk of this growth is coming from immigration. So we see it across Canada. We have to think about that for us here in New Brunswick. So a couple of quick charts on that. So if you look at Toronto, for example, the share of all of the workers in the contact center industry in Toronto, 55% are first-generation immigrants. Only 5% in New Brunswick. So Toronto has figured out that if it wants to grow industries, key industries, it's going to have to bring in workers, and it's done a very, very good job at that. If you look at the manufacturing workforce, 76% of everybody that's working in manufacturing occupations in the Greater Toronto Area are first-generation immigrants. 76%, 3 out of every 4 workers. It's 3% in New Brunswick. In fact, we have manufacturing companies that are closing plants in New Brunswick and moving them to Toronto because they can get immigrant workers in Toronto at the same wage levels they were paying in New Brunswick. Another great example is the Manitoba example. So if you look at the workforce growth or decline in New Brunswick by those that were born in Canada versus those that are immigrants, there's been an 8,100 decline among those born in New Brunswick. So the labor force in New Brunswick among those born in Canada has actually declined by 8,100, and it's increased by 3,700 among the immigrant population. But if you look at Manitoba, which is roughly the same size as New Brunswick, slightly larger, it's actually seen a similar decline in its born in New Brunswick, or born in Canada workforce, but it's seen 10 times the growth in its immigrant workforce. So they were ahead of us by 10 or 15 years, and they've done a great job of attracting immigrants across the spectrum to help grow their economy and strengthen their economic foundation as a province. So Canada this year is expecting to attract 305,000 immigrants. That's the level the government has set that it says we need to ensure that our economy can continue to grow. New Brunswick will probably attract less than 1%. So this is a fundamental struggle for us as we look to grow our economy and create a strong foundation for the future. Where will our new immigrants work? Well, as I said before, we hope they will work in our export industries. We're going to do a good job of targeting the types of workers with the types of skills that we need for our export industries. We also need immigrant investors. If you think about our farming sector, we're going to target, and we'd like to bring in a lot more farmers to bring in immigrants to work in our farming sector. But there's also other industries. If you look at many of our businesses are facing succession challenges, and we think immigration can be a way to help bring in new investment into our province. We also think there's opportunity to bring immigrant workers into our home care sector. Too many New Brunswickers have to go into institutionalized care at a certain age. We think there's a lot more opportunity to bring in workers to help that sector of our economy as well. And then in the longer term, we want to use immigration to rebalance our demographics. So we want to have a younger population coming in to balance the older population as it ages and make sure we have a strong labor market and ultimately economic foundation so that we can continue to have the public services, the quality public services that we care about in this province, around the province. But I also want to point out quickly that immigration itself creates economic growth. That's the little secret. If we had been attracting immigrants over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we would have a stronger economy today. I estimate that every 1,000 immigrant families that are earning the average household income in the province generate enough demand in the province to support 1,500 jobs. Jobs in retail and restaurants and service sectors. Across the economy, lawyers, doctors, pharmacists. It's creating demand, but because our population hasn't been growing, because our economy is flat, we're not creating the demand for these highly skilled jobs in the economy, and so immigration will actually help us do that. But are we ready for a wave of immigrants? I think this is the question we all have to ask ourselves. Are we ready? We've seen a slight increase here in the Moncton area and certainly in the urban areas, but we haven't seen a significant wave of immigration in a very long time. In fact, the last time the province saw enough immigration to significantly change the population dynamic was actually in the mid-19th century. It's around 1850, 1860. That's the last time we saw a major push of immigration into our province. So that's a pretty long time, 150 years ago. I don't think anybody in this room was there. In fact, if you look at the data from the National Household Survey, over 90% of all New Brunswickers are at least third-generation Canadian. That means they were born in Canada, their parents were born in Canada, and their parents' parents were born in Canada. And then in many cases, many generations beyond that. In the northeastern part of the province, nearly 100%, 98% of everybody living in northeastern New Brunswick is at least a third-generation Canadian. 90% of everybody living in Moncton is at least a third generation. So the point I'm trying to make is there's not a lot of familiarity with immigration. We're not that used to it. And if we're going to ramp up the number of immigrants coming here, if we want to keep them here, if we want to integrate them into our communities and into our society, it's going to take a change in how we do things. I would argue the time to act is now. So some people say to me, well, why don't you just convince young people to have more kids and that'll solve our problem? Actually, it won't. Because our problem is going to occur now over the next 10, 15, 20 years. That's where the real bubble is occurring. If we can't solve our labor market challenges in the short window, then it's going to really affect our economy moving forward. So sure, it's great for young people to have more kids. That's wonderful, but it's not going to solve our problem in the short term. So I would argue we need to boost our immigrant levels from, this is across the province, around 2,000 today, a little more than 2,000 a year now. We need to get up to, I would argue, about 1% of the population, which would be 7,500 per year. And I think we need to sustain that out for 10, 15, or 20 years. And I think that will really help solidify the economy and the fiscal foundation for the province. And ultimately, I think immigration will make New Brunswick a better place. It will help us position ourselves in this new global economy. We need to do that. We need to see where New Brunswick, even though it's a small province, we need to see where we fit in the global economy, and I think attracting a more multicultural population will help us do that. Thank you very much.